Hello and welcome to the webinar. Good afternoon from London. My name is Catherine Eveland. I am Senior Marketing Executive for Integer's Wire and Cable team. And today I will be hosting a quick 15-minute interview with our Senior Analyst and Editor of the Market for Specialty Cable, Louisa Winnick. We're going to kick off with a few questions from myself, and then we'd like to take some questions from the audience. So during the time while I'm asking some questions, if you guys have some questions that you want to enter in, there is a box in the top left-hand corner of your window where you can enter in questions there. If you're unable to see the question box, there are icons located at the bottom of your screen. You'll find a purple icon with a Q&A logo, and if you click on that one, it will open up the box where you can submit your questions. All the windows are customizable, and also just underneath the Q&A box there is a list of links where you can download the brochure and also access our website where we have the full table of contents, a list of figures as well as tables, and a free downloads of example data. So with that being said, also if you have any technical questions, feel free to put them in as well. Don't worry. But anyways, let's begin. Hi, Louisa, thank you for joining me. So recently, the Wire and Cable team has been producing a number of very thorough databases. And this is the first large-scale report that we've seen for over a year now. So why specialty?
Hi, Katie. So firstly, we've had a lot of requests for the update of our 2011 report. And unlike the wider insulated wire and cable market, these sectors are driven by a big range of factors, and the demand for cable in each of the industries that we're covering often doesn't match the wider trends in insulated wire and cable consumption. So it's a new area for us to look at.
Can you give us a brief overview of what you found?
So on the one hand, the renewable sector is looking really strong. So we're seeing that is going to have the most growth in demand in the next 5 years, with the growth forecast in both wind turbine production and installations, as well as a really rapid increase in solar PV power installations too. So on the other hand, actually cable demand for shipboard, for offshore oil and gas, for mining, we're seeing is under much more pressure as the low oil prices and a more lackluster economic climate is really starting to dampen demand for those industries.
I guess before we go any further, I'd like to frame how Integer defines specialty cable, specifically for this report. My understanding is it can encompass various kinds of cable. So I want to hear your definition for it.
So Integer understands specialty cable to cover all types of cable that are produced for a specific end use, so ones that have guideline specifications in certain industries, and including those that are specifically created in custom runs for particular end users. However, the data in this particular report focuses on specialty power cable, and it focuses on 6 different sectors. So that's merchant and military shipping, renewable energy, covering both solar and wind power, offshore oil and gas, rolling stock, mining, and aerospace as well.
Can you tell us why you chose these 6 markets?
We began the report last year, so about 18 months since we started, and we got in touch with a number of our previous customers, as well as a lot of key players in the industry to see what they wanted to hear about. And the industries that are covered really reflect that initial feedback. We do still get asked occasionally about why we didn't include the automotive market. And I guess a really significant reason was because of the sheer size and scope. We didn't think we could do it justice as just one chapter in a larger study.
So it seems like it could get quite complex. Could you tell us a little bit more about how what the scope of the study is, and how did you define that?
So each chapter of the report looks at each sector in turn. So for each chapter, if I talk about, for example, shipboard, we look at a section on the features of the industry, the trends and the changes in the market, and then start to look at the point of consumption for cable. We then look at the estimates for the total value of specialty power cable demand, And then finally, we look at specialty power cable production, and we look at that by country and by company.
So that's it for my questions. I'd like to turn to the audience. And I'm seeing a few questions come in, and we've had a couple of questions submitted before this as well. As we kind of wait for a few more to trickle in, I have just one last one, and that is basically, who else from the team worked on the report?
Yes, so it wasn't just me. I worked closely with our wire and cable director, Philip Radbourne, who produced our first specialty report back in 2011, and also with Josie Armstrong, who worked particularly on the mining chapter. Prior to working at Integer, Josie worked in Australia, so she managed reports out there looking at mining for crew strategies, and before that as a market analyst for BP as well. We've also been able to focus more on what's been happening in Asia. So we've had the help of Andrea Valentini, who's one of our analysts based in Tokyo, and it's also been especially valuable for us to work with Rachel Lee, who's based in South Korea. And she used to be the Director of Strategy and Business Planning at LS Investment and Development, and worked at LS Cable, participating in the acquisition of Superior Essex. So Rachel's input has been incredibly valuable.
Fantastic, thank you. Okay, so looking at some of these questions, I'm seeing some of them are a little bit similar, so I'm kind of group them here. First off, I guess we should look at, somebody's asked, is it regional or is it global?
So the report includes cable production and demand by each sector, and it includes that globally and then into 5 separate regions. So we look at Asia Pacific and South Asia, Europe, Latin America, the Middle East and Africa, and North America. And for demand, we also include coverage of 20 key countries, so we include numbers for them across each sector, and those countries are very, very quickly run through. We look at Australia, Brazil, Canada, China, France, Germany, India, Italy, Japan, Mexico, Morocco, Norway, Russia, Saudi Arabia, South Korea, Spain, Turkey, the UK, UAE, and the US. And we also, on top of that, include another 20 top countries for each of the selected industries. For production, we analyse the share of the leading global producers, and we provide production revenue on a company-by-company basis, as well as looking at where that production is based on by country. And again, this is covering each of the 6 sectors.
Okay. Also, I have another question here asking what companies are covered. I don't know if we could go over all of the companies, but maybe if you could give us a brief overview of what those companies are, maybe a few examples.
Yes, so we include more than 250 parent companies in the report. So we split out their subsidiaries, and as I said, we split out the countries where they produce the specialty power cable. So this means we are covering the biggest countries in these industries, so the Prysmian, the Nexans, General Cable, but then a lot of small and mid-range producers like Metsk, JDR, Hellkammer, Telefonica, and then of course the much longer tail of smaller producers. So we're looking at those in China, in India, as well as in the US.
That's great. Also here we've asked, because we haven't included the vertical industries in our slides, if you could repeat basically what the chapters cover. And also somebody was saying, if you split it out, it could possibly be 8. There's 8 sectors. How do you split out the chapters like merchant and military shipping or the renewables sector? If you could go into more detail.
Yes, so we include 6 different chapters, but we group the first 2 together. So the first chapter is on merchant and military shipping, and we provide separate numbers for production and demand for each of those sectors. And we do the same for renewables. We have one chapter on renewables, but that provides separate numbers for wind power and for solar power cables. The other 4 chapters that we look at are offshore oil and gas, rolling stock, mining, and aerospace.
We also just had a question come here basically, do you focus on a specific area more than others, or is it kind of equally, how did you split out the chapters?
Yeah, we don't focus on one more than the other, not at all. We recognise that some areas are much larger than others, but in terms of the report, we're looking at each industry fairly equally. They're fairly similar scope and scale of each chapter.
One of the questions that we kind of came across, somebody had submitted it prior to this webinar, was how did you gather the data and research? Like basically, who did we approach, or what sectors are you looking at to get the research together?
So me and the team visited key cable producers, end users, EPC engineering and consulting companies. So we've been in touch with people in Europe, in the US, in Korea, Japan, Singapore and Dubai as well. So it means in each sector we were able to look at the cable market for new build, as well as retrofit and repair and maintenance, along with looking at more details, looking at the specifications and the standards that are required for each end use. And that means that we've then been able to look a little bit deeper and break out the key drivers by each end use sector and by each product type, so going into more depth with the products, so for shipping, looking from cruise ships to naval submarines. And overall, this demand methodology has been based on this fieldwork over the last 18 months. And that has allowed us to build up a really detailed picture of the electrical installation requirements in these end users. So we've looked at the install and then the typical amount of cable that's going into each sector.
Could you elaborate on electrical install?
Yes, so we first looked at electrical installation when we looked at construction for our report on fire performance cables. And for construction, we used the SPONS pricing methodology to determine electrical install. And for specialty, we've had to find new ways of identifying how much is the total value of the industry is the electrical system itself. So how much the electrical system is worth in certain ships or certain planes, for example.
We're getting a couple more questions kind of in on methodology. Some of these questions are a little bit more specific. I would like to note that any questions that we can't get to, we will follow up after this interview. But for the last couple, I was hoping that we could focus mainly on production and demand, and if you could kind of go into more detail on how you produce the methodology for these.
Yes. So for demand, we've looked at the total value of the industry itself. So for each one of these chapters, we've been identifying certain things to look at the actual industry itself. And a really big part of the report was identifying what factors we could use, so some being much more straightforward than others. So we used the value of ship completions by different types for merchant shipboard, for example. From there, we looked at this electrical installation, so the proportion of the total value that's for the electrical system. And then finally, the share that is for specialty power cable. And the choice of measure for each industry value has also been very dependent on where the point of cable consumption is in the supply chain. So in some cases, the final end-use demand of a product is very different to the point of consumption for cable. So where that cable is installed could be very different than the actual end use for the industry itself. So to give just a short example, for aerospace, a lot of the cable is consumed in the wiring harness, and that might be in a completely different country to where the end aircraft is actually produced. So our estimates of country by country specialty power cable consumption reflect the location where that cable is actually consumed in the bigger supply chain.
And sorry, could you go through how production is different as well? Thank you.
So for production, we've drawn on our in-house knowledge of insulated wiring cable production by plant. So some of you may have already purchased our plant data for Europe or for the US, for example. And in these databases, we identify total specialty power cable produced by company alongside all the other types of cable that are produced at each plant. So we tell you how much insulated cable Nexans is producing in France, for example, and how much of that is specialty power cable. The additional value that we're giving in this report is identifying the end use for that specialty cable. So whether that power cable produced by Nexans in France is going into the mining sector or renewables or something else.
Thank you, Louisa. I was just going to say this is a good note to end on right now. I see that we do have some questions that we haven't been able to reach, but as I said earlier, we will follow up with you directly after this session. This was just a quick snapshot, really, of what this report can provide. And if you, specific queries that you have, we will get in touch. Thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you for submitting your questions. They're really appreciated. As you can see here, we've got some contact details on this next slide for how to order, and if you'd like to go and access more information, again, on the left-hand side, there are links to the brochure, which illustrates the methodology that Louisa was asked about earlier, as well as what you receive, and if you'd like a copy of our contact details. Thank you so much again for joining us, and hope to speak with you shortly. Take care.